She ran across states to escape a monster. But what happens when that monster finds her again, right when she finally starts to belong somewhere? This story teaches us, you can't outrun your past, but you can choose how you face it. This channel is dedicated to Western stories of cowboys, love, motherhood, compassion, and the deep connections between people tested by life. If you're ready for more gripping stories like this, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe.
The sound of a deadbolt sliding shut was a heavy metallic click that Cora Vance could still hear over the brutal clatter of the stagecoach wheels. It was a sound she had learned to hate. Over the past month, 3 different ranchers in 3 different dusty Texas towns had taken one look at her from their porches, assessed her too thin frame, her faded calico dress, and the unsmiling hard line of her jaw, and shut their doors. They had paid the agency for a soft, compliant mail-order bride to warm their beds and bake their bread. They hadn't wanted a woman who looked like she had fought a war and lost. Thorn Creek was her 4th and final contract. If this man turned her away, there was nowhere left to run. Only the desert, or the phantom shadow of Gideon Vance tracking her across state lines. She preferred the desert. The stagecoach lurched violently, throwing Cora against the splintered wooden wall before grinding to a halt. A cloud of red Texas dust washed through the windowless frame, coating the back of her throat in grit. "End of the line," the driver hollered, his voice muffled by the wind. "Thorn Creek." Cora didn't wait for him to offer a hand down. She knew better than to expect chivalry out here. She pushed open the door and stepped out into the blinding, oppressive heat of high noon. The soles of her leather boots were worn paper-thin, and she could feel the burning earth the moment her feet hit the dirt. She stood in the center of the yard and took the measure of the place. Thorn Creek was a ranch on its knees. The main cabin was a sturdy but weathered structure of sun-bleached wood, its porch sagging on the left side. A rusted windmill groaned a mechanical rhythmic complaint against the hot wind, turning lazily above a half-dry water trough. It was a desolate, lonely corner of the world. To Cora, it looked like heaven. "You the mail-order lady?" Cora turned. A boy stood near the edge of the barn. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wearing oversized denim trousers held up by worn suspenders. A layer of grime smeared his pale cheeks, but his eyes were sharp and profoundly watchful. He clutched an empty tin bucket to his chest like a shield. "I am," Cora said, her voice raspy from the dust. "My name is Cora. You must be Caleb." The boy didn't smile. He took a step backward, his gaze darting nervously toward the dark, gaping maw of the barn behind him. "You should run," he whispered, his voice barely carrying over the wind, "before my pa comes out." Before Cora could process the warning, the shadows inside the barn shifted. The heavy, rhythmic clink of silver spurs preceded him. Silas Thorne stepped out into the punishing sunlight, casting a long, broad shadow across the cracked earth. He was a mountain of a man, built of hard labor and exhaustion. He wore a canvas duster coated in pale dust, his Stetson pulled low over eyes the color of a bruised winter sky. The lines carved around his mouth were deep, etched by grief and a relentless, unforgiving landscape. He stopped a few yards from her. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't even look at her face. His gaze swept over her in one swift, ruthless assessment, taking in her narrow shoulders, her hollowed cheekbones, and the complete lack of meat on her bones. He was looking for a partner strong enough to survive Thorn Creek, and he had already found her lacking. Silas shifted his jaw, his expression hardening into stone. He looked past her to the driver, who was unstrapping cargo from the roof. "Send her back," Silas barked, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in Cora's chest. "She won't last a week out here." Cora's stomach plummeted, but she didn't flinch. She locked her knees to keep them from trembling. "Fare's already paid, Thorne," the driver called back, entirely unbothered. He tossed a battered leather valise onto the dirt, followed by a heavy 50-pound canvas sack of flour. "Agency says no refunds. She's your problem now." The driver cracked his whip. The mules surged forward and the stagecoach rattled away, leaving Cora in a suffocating cloud of red dust. When the air cleared, the silence in the yard was absolute. Caleb watched with wide eyes. Silas stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked beneath his beard. He looked at Cora with barely concealed resentment, seeing her not as a woman, but as another useless burden the bank and the world had dropped on his shoulders. "I don't have the time or the food to keep a fragile woman alive, miss," Silas said, the words sharp and devoid of warmth. "The next stage passes through town in 3 days. You'll be on it." He turned his back on her, dismissing her entirely, and started walking back toward the barn. No. The word echoed in Cora's skull. She had not bled, starved, and hidden in freight trains for hundreds of miles, just to be sent back to slaughter because a cowboy thought she looked weak. She didn't weep. She didn't beg. Pity was a useless currency. Cora marched past him, stepping directly toward the heavy 50-pound sack of flour the driver had dumped in the dirt. It was easily a third of her own body weight. "What do you think you're doing?" Silas growled, turning back around. Cora didn't answer. She reached down, her fingers gripping the coarse canvas. Realizing the fabric of her dress was restricting her movement, she swiftly unbuttoned the cuff of her right sleeve and rolled it up past her elbow to get better leverage. The blazing Texas sun hit her bare forearm. Silas's breath hitched, a harsh sound in the quiet yard. His eyes locked onto her exposed skin. From her wrist to her elbow, a jagged, horrific matrix of silvered burn scars and raised whip welts twisted across her flesh. It was a map of unspeakable survived violence. It was not the skin of a fragile, coddled woman. It was the skin of a soldier who had been through hell and refused to burn to ash. Cora ignored his stare. She gritted her teeth, braced her boots against the cracked earth, and heaved. Her muscles screamed, her slender arms trembling violently under the crushing weight. But she didn't drop it. She hoisted the 50-pound sack onto her shoulder, staggering for a fraction of a second before finding her balance. Slowly, she turned her head to look Silas Thorne dead in the eye. "I'm not asking you to marry me, Mr. Thorne," Cora said, her voice steady and lethal. "I'm asking which way to the kitchen." Silas stared at her. The anger drained from his features, replaced by a stark, silent shock. He looked from the terrible scars on her arm to the fierce, unyielding fire in her eyes. He recognized that look. It was the exact same look he saw in the mirror every morning. The look of an animal backed into a corner, ready to bite through bone to stay alive. The wind howled between them, kicking up dust against their boots. For a long, tense moment, neither moved. Then Silas exhaled heavily. He reached up, tipping the brim of his Stetson back, and stepped aside, clearing the path to the cabin. "Stay," he grated out, his voice stripped of its previous hostility, leaving only a raw, exhausted truth. "Just for the children." The Texas sky was the color of a fresh bruise, a heavy, swollen purple that pressed down against the flat horizon. The air inside the cabin was thick, tasting of old wood smoke and the metallic tang of impending rain. Cora Vance woke before dawn, her body aching from the punishing stagecoach ride and the sheer, terrifying weight of what she had done. She lay on a narrow cot in a cramped room off the kitchen, staring up at the rough-hewn rafters. She didn't have the luxury of regret. Regret was a ghost that only haunted the idle, and out here, idleness meant death. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet touching the cold floorboards. After dressing in her faded calico and pulling her dark hair into a severe knot at the nape of her neck, she stepped into the kitchen. The room was bathed in the gray half-light of morning. Standing beside the cast-iron stove was a small shadow. Cora stopped. It was Maeve. The 6-year-old girl wore a frayed nightgown that swallowed her thin frame. Her wild, dark hair was a tangled halo around a face that was too solemn for a child. But it was her hands that drew Cora's attention. Held tightly behind the girl's back, a sliver of dull silver caught the dim light. A small hunting knife. Cora didn't gasp. She didn't offer a sweet, condescending smile. She recognized a defensive posture when she saw one. "Fire's cold," Cora said evenly, keeping her distance as she moved toward the dry sink. "I was going to put the coffee on. Do you know where your father keeps the matches?" Maeve didn't speak. Her dark eyes, so much like Silas's, tracked Cora's every movement with feral intensity. Slowly, the child nodded toward a rusted tin box on the mantel. "Obliged," Cora murmured. She struck a match, the sudden flare of sulfur illuminating the tense kitchen. She lit the stove, her movements deliberate and unhurried. She didn't ask about the knife. She didn't tell the girl to put it away. Taking a weapon from a frightened creature only made them bite. By the time the coffee was boiling, sending a bitter, comforting aroma through the cabin, Maeve had vanished back into the shadows of the hallway. Cora poured a cup, black as pitch, and stepped out onto the front porch. The wind was picking up, whipping fine red dust across the yard. Near the barn, the rusted water pump groaned a miserable, high-pitched screech every time the wind caught its iron handle. There was no water in the trough. She set her coffee down. In the shed, she found a heavy iron wrench and an oil rag. From the loft of the barn, Silas Thorne watched her. He had been awake since 3, mending a saddle, expecting the new mail-order bride to either still be weeping in her bed or packing her bags. Instead, he watched Cora march up to the stubborn water pump. She didn't look at it with helpless despair. She gripped the wrench with both hands, planted her boots in the dirt, and threw her weight into breaking the rusted bolts loose. Silas's brow furrowed. The wind whipped her skirt around her legs, but she ignored it, wiping a smear of black grease across her forehead as she dismantled the heavy iron casing. She worked with a grim, rhythmic determination, her hands capable and unafraid of the dirt. He had expected a delicate flower. Instead, the agency had sent him a weed, the kind with deep, stubborn roots that cracked through solid rock. An hour later, a heavy, rhythmic clanking sound echoed across the yard. Cora was pumping the handle, and thick, clear water was finally gushing into the dry trough. "Pa said not to touch that." Cora turned, wiping her grease-stained hands on a rag. Caleb was standing near the woodpile, clutching a few pieces of kindling to his chest. He looked at the flowing water, then at her, his expression caught between awe and suspicion. "Your pa has cattle to feed and fences to mend," Cora said, her breath coming slightly short from the exertion. "A pump is just iron and grease. No sense letting a man do what a wrench can fix." Caleb opened his mouth to reply, but the words died in his throat. His eyes widened, fixing on a spot in the dry brush less than 2 feet from his boots. Ch, 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 ch. The sound was unmistakable, a dry electric rattle that froze the blood in Cora's veins. A timber rattlesnake, thick as a man's forearm, had coiled itself in the shadows of the woodpile. Its triangular head was raised, tongue flicking, ready to strike the boy's calf. Caleb was paralyzed, his knuckles white around the kindling. "Don't move, Caleb," Cora breathed. Her eyes darted around the yard. Leaning against the porch railing was a Winchester repeating rifle, likely left there by Silas the night before. Cora didn't think. She moved. She lunged for the porch, her fingers wrapping around the smooth, worn walnut stock of the rifle. She swung it up, racking the lever with a sharp clack. She had watched men fire guns. But the weight of the Winchester was a brutal surprise. It was heavy, pulling her arms down. She aimed down the barrel at the coiled serpent. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot was a deafening roar that tore through the quiet morning. The heavy .44 caliber slug obliterated the snake, spraying dust and scale into the air. But the recoil was monstrous. The brass butt plate slammed into Cora's shoulder with the force of a kicking mule. Because her stance was narrow and her weight unbalanced, the impact threw her backward. She hit the hard-packed dirt of the yard with a jarring thud, the breath knocked entirely out of her lungs. "Cora!" The barn doors banged open. Silas crossed the yard in long, frantic strides. his face pale beneath his tan. He reached Caleb first, grabbing the boy by the shoulders, checking him for bite marks. Seeing the boy was unharmed, his gaze snapped to the decimated snake, and then to Cora, who was gasping for air in the dirt, the Winchester lying in the dust beside her. Silas closed the distance between them. He didn't offer a gentle hand. He grabbed her by the upper arm and hauled her roughly to her feet. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he roared, the anger masking his adrenaline. "You could have shattered your collarbone holding a rifle like that." Cora wrenched her arm out of his grip, her shoulder throbbing with a sickening ache. "I killed the snake, didn't I?" she shot back, her eyes blazing. Silas stared down at her. Her hair had come loose from its knot, framing her dirt-smudged face in wild tendrils. Her breathing was ragged, but she didn't shrink away from him. He looked at the rifle in the dirt, then bent and picked it up. He wiped the dust from the barrel with the heel of his hand, his jaw working. "Stand up straight," he commanded, his voice dropping an octave, losing its fury and taking on a dangerous, quiet authority. Cora hesitated, then squared her shoulders. Silas stepped behind her. The sudden proximity of his massive frame made her breath catch. He smelled of leather, sweat, and gun oil. He pressed the heavy rifle back into her hands. "Spread your feet," he said, his deep voice vibrating right by her ear. "Shoulder width. Plant your dominant leg back." She shifted her boots in the dirt. Silas reached around her. His large, calloused hands covered hers on the rifle. His chest brushed against her back, a solid, undeniable wall of heat. Cora's pulse, which had just begun to slow, spiked violently. "Pull the stock tight into the meat of your shoulder," he instructed, his fingers pressing the wood firmly into her collar. "Don't let it float. If there's a gap, it'll break your bones. If you hold it tight, it just pushes you. You control the weapon, Cora. It doesn't control you." He stepped back, leaving her suddenly cold, despite the Texas heat. "Load it," he said softly. "Show me." With trembling fingers, Cora worked the lever, ejecting the spent brass casing. It hit the dirt with a hollow ping. She pulled the rifle tight against her bruised shoulder, leaning into the weight, and sighted down the barrel at a dead stump 50 yards away. She didn't fire, but she held the stance, solid, unmovable. Silas watched her, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He gave a single, slow nod. "Better." The sharp crack of a whip interrupted the heavy silence. A rider on a lathered horse was trotting down the long drive toward the cabin. It was the county mail carrier. "Thorne," the rider called out, reining in his horse. "Got a dispatch from Abilene, and a letter for the missus." Silas stepped forward to take the leather pouch, his eyes narrowing at the rider. He handed a single plain white envelope to Cora. It was devoid of a stamp, bearing only her name written in a precise, slanted script. Cora's blood turned to ice. She knew that handwriting. She would know it if she were blind. She turned away from Silas, her hands shaking so badly she could barely break the wax seal. She slid her finger under the flap and pulled out the single sheet of paper. There was no greeting, no signature. Just one line of ink that seemed to burn into her retinas. "Do your scars still ache, Cora?" The paper fluttered from her numb fingers, landing in the red dust. The wind, howling down from the bruised sky, snatched it away. Gideon Vance was not a ghost. He was real. He was hunting, and he was getting closer. The smell of death hung heavy over the southern creek bed. Silas sat in his saddle, his gloved hands gripping the reins so tightly the leather creaked. Below him, in the muddy shallows where the water ran sluggish and warm, lay 3 of his prime Hereford steers. Their bellies were bloated, their lifeless eyes staring up at the unforgiving Texas sun. There were no bullet holes, no signs of a predator attack. Beside him, Pete, the aging ranch hand with a bum knee and a face like weathered leather, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Wolfsbane in the feed," Pete rasped, his eyes scanning the tree line. "Or arsenic in the water. Ain't natural, Silas. This is Blackwood's doing." I know whose doing it is, Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Thaddeus Blackwood was a man who fought his wars from behind a mahogany desk. He had been slowly suffocating Thorn Creek for 2 years, buying up the surrounding land, damming the water sources, and paying off Silas's hired hands to leave in the dead of night. Now he was poisoning the herd. It was a message: sell or starve. Silas wheeled his horse around. Saddle the wagon, Pete. I'm going into town to see the bank. We're taking the woman and the kids. I don't want them out here alone today. An hour later, the heavy wooden wagon jolted along the rutted road toward the town of Oakhaven. The heat was a living thing, pressing down on Cora's shoulders like a lead blanket. She sat beside Silas on the buckboard, her posture rigidly straight. The Colt .45 Silas had left on the kitchen table, now secretly tucked beneath the folds of her skirt. The memory of the letter burned in her mind, but she kept her face an unreadable mask. Oakhaven was a booming cattle town, a chaotic mix of raw timber buildings, false front saloons, and dusty boardwalks crowded with ranchers, drifters, and women in high-buttoned collars. When Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, the street seemed to quiet down. Eyes turned toward them. Cora felt the weight of their stares. The local women peering over their parasols, the men on the saloon porch nudging each other. They looked at her plain, dust-stained dress and her gaunt face. She knew what they saw: a desperate mail-order bride, a piece of property Silas Thorne had bought out of a catalog because no respectable local woman would take on a failing ranch and another woman's children. Cora lifted her chin. She didn't shrink. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for Silas's help, her boots hitting the boardwalk with a solid, defiant thud. "Take the kids to the apothecary for peppermints," Silas told Pete in a low voice. He turned to Cora. "I need to see the bank manager. Go into the mercantile and get the supplies on this list. Tell Miller to put it on my ledger." Cora took the crumpled piece of paper. "I can handle it." Inside the general store, the air was stifling, smelling of salted pork, leather, and dried lavender. Mr. Miller, a rotund man with a slicked-back comb-over, stood behind the counter. He watched Cora approach with a patronizing smirk. "You must be the new addition to Thorn Creek," Miller said, his eyes lingering on her faded dress. "What can I do for you, little lady?" "I need 50 pounds of winter wheat, 10 pounds of salt, 2 spools of barbed wire, and a tin of coffee," Cora said flatly, sliding the list across the glass counter. "Put it on Silas Thorne's ledger." Miller sighed heavily, pulling a thick leather book from under the counter. He dragged a stubby finger down the page. "Well now, Miss Thorne's credit is stretched mighty thin. Given the risks out at his property lately, I'm afraid I've had to adjust my prices. Wheat's gone up to $3 a sack. Wire is $5. Cora froze. She had spent years balancing the books for Gideon's transport business before she fled. She knew the market rates for grain and steel better than she knew the Bible. $3 for a 50-pound sack of winter wheat? Cora asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Supply and demand, little lady," Miller said with a shrug. Cora planted both hands on the glass counter and leaned in. The Union Pacific railhead in Abilene just took a massive delivery of grain 2 days ago, causing a surplus. The market price for a 50-pound sack is $1.40. You're holding old stock, Mr. Miller, which means it's prone to weevils. I'll give you $1.20 for it, and you'll sell me the wire at $2 flat, or I will walk across the street to the telegraph office and order it from Fort Worth myself. Miller's smug smile vanished. He blinked, completely caught off guard by the venom and precise arithmetic coming from the frail-looking woman. "Now, see here." $1.20, Cora repeated, her eyes cold as flint. "And you will write it in that ledger clearly, or Silas will come in here and have a conversation with you about how you treat his family." From the doorway, a low, breathy chuckle broke the tension. Cora glanced back. Silas was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his broad chest. The brim of his hat shadowed his eyes, but the faint, undeniable curve of a smirk was visible on his lips. he hadn't intervened. He had watched her fight her own battle, and the profound, blazing respect in his posture made Cora's breath hitch. "You heard my wife, Miller," Silas said, pushing off the doorframe and walking into the store. He laid a heavy hand on the counter. "Ring it up at $1.20. Miller swallowed hard, his face flushing red. "Yes, Silas, right away." 10 minutes later, Silas was loading the heavy sacks of grain into the back of the wagon. The oppressive heat of the afternoon had settled over the town, baking the wooden boardwalks. "I didn't need you to step in," Cora said quietly, standing by the wagon wheel. "I know you didn't," Silas replied, hoisting a spool of barbed wire. He paused, looking down at her. The hostility that had marked their first meeting was gone, replaced by a cautious, simmering awareness. "You've got teeth, Cora. I'll give you that." "I had to learn to bite early in life." Silas looked like he wanted to ask about the scars, about the shadows that lived behind her eyes. But a shout from down the street drew his attention. Pete was waving at him from outside the apothecary. "Stay here," Silas told her. "I'll fetch the kids and we'll ride out." Cora leaned against the rough wood of the wagon, seeking a sliver of shade. Across the street, the double doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon swung open. A drifter walked out, adjusting a worn Stetson. He was a lean, wiry man with a knife scar slicing through his left eyebrow. He carried a saddlebag over his shoulder, walking with a loose, predatory swagger. As he stepped off the boardwalk into the dusty street, he started to whistle. Cora's heart stopped beating. It was an off-key, fragmented rendition of "In the Sweet By and By." The sound hit Cora with the physical force of a sledgehammer. Her vision blurred at the edges, her lungs constricted, refusing to take in air. It was a hymn, a holy song, but Gideon Vance had never whistled it in church. He had only ever whistled that specific off-key tune when he was walking down the hallway of their home in Atlanta, a leather belt wrapped around his knuckles, coming to teach her a lesson. Cora pressed her spine against the wagon wheel, her fingers instinctively digging into her skirt to feel the hard iron of the colt hidden beneath the fabric. The drifter walked past the wagon, not looking at her. He paused near the alleyway beside the bank. A well-dressed man in a tailored suit, Thaddeus Blackwood, stepped out of the shadows. The drifter handed Blackwood a folded piece of paper, nodded once, and kept walking. The whistling faded into the ambient noise of the town, but it echoed like a scream in Cora's skull. Gideon didn't just find her by accident. He hadn't tracked her blindly. Thaddeus Blackwood, the man trying to destroy Silas Thorne, had hired a monster to do his dirty work. Blackwood and Gideon were working together. "Don't run," Silas's voice echoed in her memory. Cora closed her eyes, the terror in her chest crystallizing into something entirely different. It turned cold. It turned to iron. She opened her eyes, staring at the alley where Blackwood had stood, her hand gripping the hidden gun so tightly her knuckles ached. She wasn't going to run. She was going to burn them both to the ground. The Texas Panhandle did not issue warnings when it decided to turn violent. The sky, which had been a bruised, oppressive purple all afternoon, suddenly bled into a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The air grew perfectly still, thick with the smell of ozone and sulfur. Then the horizon simply vanished, swallowed by a towering, roiling wall of copper-red earth moving at 40 miles an hour. "Dust!" Pete roared from the corral, his voice barely cutting through the sudden deafening shriek of the wind. "Get the stock in! Tie down the loose timber!" Inside the cabin, Cora didn't hesitate. She shoved Caleb and Maeve under the heavy oak dining table. "Stay there. Do not come out no matter what you hear. Understand?" Caleb nodded, his small arms wrapped protectively around his sister. Cora tied a flour sack around the lower half of her face, grabbed a coil of heavy hemp rope from the corner, and kicked the front door open. The wind hit her like a physical blow, driving razor-sharp granules of sand into her eyes and exposed skin. The world had been reduced to a violent, howling twilight. She fought her way across the yard, leaning into the gale. Near the barn, Silas was a massive, dark silhouette, fighting to muscle a panicked, half-wild Mustang into its stall. The animal was screaming, its eyes rolling white with terror, rearing up and striking the air with iron-shod hooves. "Silas!" Cora screamed over the roaring wind, rushing forward to grab the flailing lead rope. "Get back in the house!" Silas bellowed, his boots sliding in the loose, shifting dirt as he fought the 1,000-pound animal. "She's feral, Cora, get back!" But Cora didn't retreat. She lunged for the rope, wrapping it twice around her forearms, digging her worn boot heels into the earth to add her meager weight as an anchor. Together, they managed to pull the Mustang a foot closer to the barn doors. Then the sky split open. A jagged fork of lightning struck the ridge a mile away, followed instantly by a thunderclap that shook the ground. The Mustang lost its mind. With a squeal of absolute terror, the horse surged backward, snapping its head violently. The sheer force ripped the coarse rope through Cora's hands, tearing the skin from her palms. The animal wheeled around, kicking out with its hind legs in a blind panic. The heavy iron shoe caught Silas dead in the center of his chest. There was a sickening, hollow crack that Cora felt more than heard over the storm. Silas was lifted off his feet and thrown backward into the mud that was rapidly forming as the heavens opened, unleashing a torrential freezing rain that mixed with the airborne dust to create a barrage of flying mud. Silas hit the ground and did not move. "Silas!" Cora scrambled through the blinding muck, dropping to her knees beside him. He was unconscious, his face deathly pale beneath the grime, his chest hitching in shallow, ragged gasps. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the yard into a freezing quagmire. If she left him here, the cold and the mud would drown him before his crushed ribs pierced a lung. "Get up!" she gritted out, grabbing him by the collar of his heavy canvas duster. "Silas! God damn it, open your eyes!" He didn't wake. He was dead weight, easily 220 pounds of solid muscle and wet wool. Cora was 95 pounds soaking wet. But the phantom sound of Gideon's whistling was still ringing in her ears from town. She had not survived a monster just to let a good man die in the mud. Cora hooked her arms under his armpits. She planted her boots in the muck, screamed through her teeth and pulled. Her muscles tore. Her vision went black at the edges. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him through the freezing sludge. The rain battered her back, soaking her faded calico dress until it clung to her like a second skin. Her breath came in raw, sobbing gasps. But she didn't stop. 10 yards. 5 yards. Finally, she hauled him over the threshold of the barn, collapsing onto the dry hay beside him. The barn doors slammed shut in the wind, plunging them into dim, shadowy relief. The air inside smelled of sweet alfalfa and horse sweat. Cora didn't allow herself to rest. She crawled over to him, her fingers clumsy and frozen, tearing at the buttons of his shirt. His chest was already blooming with an angry, sprawling purple bruise over his lower left ribs. She needed to bind it, and tightly. She looked around frantically for bandages, but the medical supplies were in the cabin. There was no time. His breathing was growing shallower. Without a second thought, Cora grabbed the hem of her soaked, ruined dress. The cheap, thin fabric had already torn along the side seam during the struggle. She ripped it upward with a violent yank, tearing a long, wide strip of cotton from her skirt, leaving her legs bare to the thigh in her worn cotton chemise. She leaned over Silas, sliding her arm beneath his broad back to lift him slightly so she could wrap the makeshift bandage. As she lifted him, Silas groaned, his eyelids fluttering open. The pain was immediate and blinding, but the first thing his unfocusing eyes registered wasn't the barn roof, it was Cora. She was leaning over him, her dress torn away, and because she was twisted, reaching beneath him, the ruined back of her dress gaped open. The lantern light flickered, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across her exposed back. Silas's breath stopped entirely. He had seen men butchered in the war. He had seen cattle torn apart by wolves, but he had never seen anything like the geography of violence mapped across Cora's spine. There were dozens of them, thick, raised keloid scars that crisscrossed her pale skin in a chaotic, overlapping lattice. Some were old and faded silver, others were newer, angry and pink. They were whip marks, buckle strikes, the deliberate, methodical work of a man who took his time breaking a human being. Silas didn't gasp. He didn't offer a soft word of modern pity or ask how she felt. In the brutal logic of the West, words were cheap. Pity was an insult to a survivor. A cold, terrifying rage, a rage so absolute it bypassed heat and went straight to ice, flooded his veins, temporarily overriding the agony in his chest. He looked at the fragile woman who had just dragged his dead weight through a mudstorm, bleeding and shivering, her hands currently binding his ribs to keep him alive. Cora finished pulling the knot tight and slumped back on her heels, swiping a muddy hand across her forehead. She met his gaze. She saw him looking at her back. She saw the moment he understood the extent of her ruin. Cora braced herself for the look she always got. The revulsion, the pity, the sudden, uncomfortable desire to look away from something broken. But Silas didn't look away. He pushed himself up on his right elbow, his face contorted in pain. With his left hand, he unbuckled his heavy, fleece-lined leather duster. He shrugged it off his good shoulder, wincing as the broken ribs ground together and dragged it across the hay. He didn't say a word. He simply draped the massive, warm coat over Cora's shivering, scarred shoulders, pulling the thick leather tight around her collar to shield her from the cold. The weight of the coat felt like a fortress. It smelled of tobacco, horsehair, and him. "I've got you," Silas rasped, his voice a low, gravelly vow that echoed in the quiet barn. Cora stared at him, her throat constricting so tightly she couldn't swallow. She pulled the lapels of the duster closer to her chest, the leather rough against her chin. For the first time in 10 years, she felt something terrifyingly fragile bloom in her chest. She felt safe. Hours later, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a steady, rhythmic, freezing rain that drummed against the tin roof of the porch. The children were asleep in the cabin, exhausted by the adrenaline. Pete was snoring in the bunkhouse. Cora sat in the rocking chair on the deep front porch, wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket over her dry clothes. A kerosene lantern hung from a rusted nail, casting a pool of warm, golden light against the encroaching dark. In her lap lay Silas's torn flannel shirt. She pushed a needle through the heavy fabric, her movements methodical and precise. A few feet away, Silas sat on a wooden crate. His chest was bound tightly under a clean union suit, his posture stiff, favoring his left side. In his hands, he held a massive bone-handled Bowie knife and a gray whetstone. Shk, shk, shk. The rhythmic sound of steel grating against stone filled the silence between them. It was a comfortable silence, devoid of the jagged hostility that had defined her arrival. The air between them had shifted. The walls hadn't come down, but they had acknowledged each other through the cracks. Silas paused, testing the edge of the blade with his thumb. A thin bead of blood immediately welled up. Satisfied, he wiped the blade on his thigh and sheathed it. He didn't reach for another tool. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, wincing slightly. He looked at Cora, watching the firelight play across her sharp cheekbones and the dark, solemn depths of her eyes. "The man in town," Silas said. His voice was quiet, blending with the sound of the rain. It wasn't a question. He had noticed her freezing outside the saloon. He had seen the terror she tried to swallow. Cora's needle stopped mid-stitch. She didn't look up from the flannel. He was whistling a hymn. A hymn. "In the sweet by and by," Cora clarified, her voice devoid of emotion, hollow and flat. "Gideon used to whistle it. Never in church. Only when he was walking down the hall toward our bedroom after he'd been drinking. When he had taken his belt off." Silas didn't offer apologies. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He stared out into the pitch-black yard, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped. "Blackwood is paying him," Silas stated, piecing it together with ruthless Western pragmatism. "Blackwood needs me gone to take the land. Your husband needs you back. They're pooling their resources." "He's not my husband anymore," Cora said sharply, finally looking up. I signed the papers in Kansas. He tore them up. Out here, Silas said, meeting her gaze. Paper doesn't mean a damn thing. Only iron does. He reached behind his back, shifting his weight. When his hand came forward, he was holding a Colt .45 single-action Army revolver. The bluing was worn off the barrel from years of use, the walnut grips smoothed by his palms. It was a heavy, serious piece of machinery. He stood up slowly, walked the 2 steps to her rocking chair, and held it out handle first. Cora looked at the gun, then up at his shadowed face. I showed you how to hold the rifle, Silas said softly. The Colt kicks harder. You keep your wrist locked straight. You don't aim with your eye. You point with your arm. He pressed the heavy, cold iron into her scarred hands. Next time he comes, Cora, Silas said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. Don't run. Don't negotiate. You put a hole straight through his chest, and you don't lose a second of sleep over it. Cora wrapped her fingers around the grip. It was heavy. It was deadly. It was the ultimate transfer of trust from a cowboy to the woman sitting on his porch. What if I miss? She whispered. Silas reached down, his rough, calloused thumb gently brushing away a stray lock of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, shockingly tender from a man made of stone. You won't, he said. The morning after the storm broke crisp and deceptively clear. The air smelled of wet sagebrush and washed earth, masking the smell of ruin. Silas was at the corral assessing the damage to the fencing when a lone rider crested the eastern ridge. The man wasn't riding hard, nor did he carry a rifle across his saddle horn. He wore a bowler hat and a neat gray suit that was entirely out of place in the mud of Thorn Creek. He was a clerk from the Oak Haven Fidelity Bank. Cora stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron, the heavy Colt secured in a holster Silas had fashioned for her beneath her skirt. She watched Silas walk to meet the rider at the gate. The exchange was brief. The clerk handed Silas a folded piece of heavy parchment, tipped his hat nervously, and wheeled his horse around, spurring the animal back toward town faster than he had arrived. Silas stood by the gate, reading the paper. From 50 yards away, Cora saw his shoulders tense. His entire massive frame went rigid, as if he had just taken a bullet to the spine. Slowly, he crumpled the heavy parchment in his fist, his knuckles turning bone white. Cora walked down the porch steps and crossed the muddy yard. When she reached him, she didn't ask what it was. She pried his fingers open and took the crumpled paper, smoothing it out against her apron. It was a notice of foreclosure. Due to repeated delinquency and reassignment of debt, the sum of $2,400 must be paid in full to the current note holder, Mr. Thaddeus Blackwood, within 5 business days. Failure to remit payment will result in the immediate seizure of all lands, structures, and livestock pertaining to Thorn Creek Ranch by the county sheriff. Blackwood bought the note, Silas said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He bought the damn note from the bank at a premium. They sold me out. Cora stared at the staggering number. $2,400. It might as well have been $1 million. Can you fight it? Is it legal to reassign a debt without notice? Legal is whatever the man with the deepest pocket says it is in Oak Haven, Silas replied bitterly. He turned to look at the sprawling acres of his ranch, the land he had bled into, the land his wife was buried on, the only inheritance he had for his children. 5 days. He knows I can't raise that kind of cash locally. He's closing the trap. Then what do we do? Cora asked, using we without thinking. Silas looked at her, his eyes dark with a desperate, calculating light. I have 200 head of prime beef in the high pasture. Blackwood poisoned the strays at the creek, but the main herd is healthy. The railhead in Abilene is paying top dollar this week to supply the eastern markets. If I can drive that herd to Abilene, I can get $3,000 for them. Abilene is a 3-day ride, Pete said, limping up behind them, having heard the commotion. And driving 200 head over the Caprock escarpment with just me and you? It's suicide, Silas. The mud from the storm will have washed out the passes. It's the only play we have left, Pete, Silas snapped. If we stay here, we lose the ranch by Friday. If we drive the herd, we have a fighting chance. Pete spat into the mud, shaking his head. And what about Blackwood's men? You think they're just going to let you walk that beef to the train? They'll ambush you in the canyons. Let them try, Silas growled, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. He turned back to Cora. The grim reality of the plan settled heavily between them. For him to save the ranch, he had to leave it completely undefended. He had to leave her undefended, knowing Gideon Vance was somewhere in the shadows, waiting for exactly this kind of opening. "I'll leave you the shotgun," Silas said, his voice tight, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "And you have the Colt. Keep the children inside. Don't open the door for anyone. Not the sheriff, not the mail rider, nobody." "Silas," Cora started, fear finally bleeding into her voice. "If Blackwood sent Gideon—" "I will be back by Thursday night," Silas interrupted, stepping closer to her. He didn't care that Pete was watching. He reached out, his large, calloused hands cupping her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his touch rough but desperately grounding. "Listen to me," Silas said, his bruised eyes locking onto hers, holding her gaze with fierce intensity. "You are not the woman who let him break her. That woman died in Atlanta. The woman standing in front of me killed a rattler, dragged my heavy ass out of a storm, and stared down Miller in town. You are a fortress, Cora. Hold the line." Cora's breath hitched. She placed her smaller hands over his wrists, feeling the steady, thumping pulse of his veins. She drew strength from the sheer, immovable force of his belief in her. "I will hold it," she whispered. Silas nodded once. He didn't kiss her. He didn't offer a romantic, cinematic farewell. He gave her a promise etched in iron. He dropped his hands, turned to Pete, and started barking orders to saddle the horses and pack the bedrolls. An hour later, Silas and Pete rode out toward the high pasture, the dogs barking at their horses' heels. Caleb and Maeve stood on the porch, watching their father disappear over the ridge. Cora didn't weep. She didn't allow herself the luxury of despair. As soon as the riders were out of sight, she turned to the children. "Caleb, go to the shed. Bring me the hammer, every iron nail you can find, and the heavy planks from the broken wagon bed." Caleb blinked. "What are we doing, Miss Cora?" "We are boarding the ground floor windows," Cora said briskly, moving toward the cabin. "Maeve, fill every bucket, pot, and tub with water from the pump. Bring them inside. If they try to smoke us out, I want enough water to drown them." For the next 6 hours, Thorn Creek transformed. The rhythmic pounding of Cora's hammer echoed across the empty plains as she drove thick iron nails through the oak planks, sealing the lower windows of the cabin, leaving only narrow slits to aim a rifle through. She dragged the heavy oak dining table and flipped it onto its side, creating a reinforced barricade facing the front door. When the sun began to dip low on the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of crimson and bruised purple, the cabin looked less like a home and more like a bunker. Cora sat Caleb down behind the overturned table. She broke open the breech of Silas's double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. "Look at me, Caleb," she said, her tone dead serious. She handed him 2 thick, red, brass-rimmed shells. "If someone breaks through that door, and I am not standing in front of it, you put these shells into these holes, snap the barrel up, pull back both of these hammers, and you pull the trigger. Do you understand me?" Caleb's hands trembled as he took the shells. "Will it kick like the rifle?" "It will kick like a demon," Cora told him honestly. "It will hurt your shoulder, but it will keep your sister alive. Do you understand?" Caleb swallowed hard, looking at Maeve, who was sitting quietly in the corner clutching a rag doll. He gripped the shells tightly and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Cora stood up, wiping the sweat from her brow. She walked to the narrow slit between the planks on the window facing south. Miles away, Silas Thorne was pushing his horse up the steep incline of the Caprock escarpment, driving the bellowing herd of cattle through the narrow pass. The mud was treacherous, the going brutally slow. His broken ribs screamed with every jolt of the saddle. He pulled his horse to a halt at the crest of the ridge, allowing the animal a moment to breathe. He couldn't shake the heavy, cold knot of dread sitting in his gut. He turned in the saddle, looking back across the vast expanse of the plains toward Thorn Creek, a half-day's ride behind him. His blood ran cold. Rising against the darkening twilight sky, distinct and terrifying, was a thick, oily plume of black smoke. It was coming from the exact coordinates of his ranch. Blackwood hadn't waited for the deadline, and Gideon Vance hadn't waited for the cover of night. "Pete!" Silas roared, violently wrenching his horse around, digging his spurs into the animal's flanks. "Turn the herd! We're going back!" The trap hadn't just closed. It had caught fire. The smoke bleeding through the cracks in the floorboards tasted of burning dry rot and alfalfa. It was not the cabin burning. It was the outer Hayward, a quarter-mile out, set ablaze to draw Silas away or to smoke out whoever was left behind. Inside the boarded-up cabin, the heat was suffocating. The kerosene lamps were extinguished. The only light came from the slivers of moonlight piercing the gaps in the heavy oak planks Cora had nailed across the windows. She stood in the center of the room, her chest rising and falling in shallow, silent breaths, the heavy Colt .45 heavy in her right hand. The ranch dogs, which had been barking furiously at the ridge half an hour ago, were entirely, terrifyingly silent. "Miss Cora," Caleb's voice was a fragile whisper from the darkness beneath the overturned dining table. "Move to the rug," Cora ordered, her voice devoid of panic, stripped down to pure command. "Pull the rug back. Open the trapdoor to the root cellar." Caleb didn't argue. He grabbed Maeve's hand and scrambled across the floorboards. The heavy iron ring of the trapdoor clanked dully as the boy hauled it upward. The cellar was nothing but a dugout pit lined with brick, smelling of damp earth, stored potatoes, and darkness. "Get down there, both of you," Cora said, stepping over to them. She knelt, pressing the double-barreled shotgun into Caleb's trembling hands. "You remember what I told you. If the door opens and it is not me, you point this upward, and you pull both triggers. You do not hesitate, Caleb. You protect your sister." Maeve let out a stifled whimper, clutching her rag doll. Cora reached down, her thumb brushing a smear of dirt from the little girl's cheek. "Quiet as mice, Maeve. The storm is going to pass." She lowered the heavy trapdoor over them and dragged a cast-iron washtub over the wooden seams to hide the cuts in the floor. Then she stood alone in the dark. For 10 minutes there was only the sound of the wind rattling the tin roof. And then, drifting through the gaps in the boarded windows, came a sound that made the blood in Cora's veins freeze into solid ice. It was a whistle, off-key, leisurely, in the sweet by and by. Footsteps crunched on the gravel of the front yard. Heavy, deliberate boots stepping onto the sagging wooden planks of the porch. There was more than one set of boots, at least 3 men. "Come on out, wife," a voice called through the thick oak of the front door. It was smooth, possessing a sickeningly pleasant southern drawl. Gideon Vance spoke like a man inviting her to a Sunday picnic, not a man who had tracked her across 3 states to drag her back to hell. "I know you're in there, Cora," Gideon continued, his voice echoing in the stifling cabin. "I saw the cowboy ride out with his herd, left you all alone. That was mighty careless of him. But then again, he doesn't know you like I do. He doesn't know how much you need a firm hand to keep you from wandering." Cora didn't speak. She moved silently to the southern window, pressing her eye to a narrow half-inch gap between the nailed planks. The moonlight illuminated the porch. Gideon stood casually by the railing, wearing a pristine gray waistcoat over a white shirt, a silver pocket watch chain glinting in the dark. He looked exactly the same. Handsome, immaculately groomed and utterly soulless. Flanking him were 2 hired guns, rough, filthy drifters holding Winchester repeaters. "Break the window," Gideon ordered one of the thugs, casually inspecting his fingernails. "Let's see how tightly she boarded herself in." One of the drifters stepped up to the window Cora was looking through. He raised the butt of his rifle and smashed it against the oak plank. The wood splintered, the heavy iron nails groaning under the impact. Cora didn't flinch. She took a half-step back, raised the Colt .45, locked her wrist just as Silas had taught her, and pointed the barrel directly at the gap in the wood where the man's shadow blocked the moonlight. She pulled the trigger. The roar of the .45 inside the sealed cabin was deafening. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in a blinding strobe of yellow fire. The heavy slug tore right through the weakened oak plank and caught the drifter square in the chest. A choked gargle sounded from the porch, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floorboards. The recoil whipped Cora's arm upward, jarring her shoulder, but she instantly brought the gun back down, cocking the hammer with her thumb. The metallic click-clack was drowned out by the sudden, furious volley of return fire. Bullets chewed through the wooden walls of the cabin. Cora dropped to the floor, covering her head as splinters of wood and shattered glass rained down in the darkness. The barrage lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. "Well now," Gideon's voice floated through the gun smoke, no longer pleasant. It had dropped into the terrifying, icy register Cora knew intimately. "You've learned a few new tricks, haven't you, sweetheart? Burn the back door down. Smoke the bitch out." And Cora scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees. The back door in the kitchen was solid wood, but it wasn't boarded as heavily as the front. She heard the heavy thud of boots on the back step, followed by the splash of kerosene hitting the wood. She crawled to the cast-iron stove. The fire inside was banked, but sitting on top was a massive 3-gallon iron kettle of water she had brought to a rolling boil an hour ago. She grabbed a thick canvas rag, wrapped it around the kettle's iron handle, and hauled it off the stove. Her muscles screamed under the weight. Through the crack beneath the back door, she saw the flicker of a match. Cora kicked the heavy iron latch of the back door upward and threw her weight backward, yanking the door wide open. The second thug was standing on the threshold, a lit match in his hand, preparing to drop it onto the kerosene-soaked wood. Before he could react, Cora heaved the 3 gallons of boiling water directly into his chest and face. The man let out a blood-curdling, inhuman shriek. The match dropped into the mud as he clawed at his face, the boiling water instantly blistering his skin. He stumbled blindly backward off the small stoop, screaming as he crashed into the water trough. Cora slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt, her breath coming in ragged, adrenaline-fueled sobs. "Two down," Gideon's voice came from the front of the house, shockingly close. He wasn't on the porch anymore. He was right outside the front door. "You always were a stubborn creature, Cora. I suppose I'll just have to break you all over again." Thwack! The blade of a heavy felling axe bit into the center of the front door, the steel edge splitting the oak with a violent crack. Cora spun around, raising the Colt. Thwack! The axe hit again, widening the split. The heavy wooden barricade she had built was holding, but the door itself was giving way. Gideon was swinging with the methodical, terrifying rhythm of a butcher breaking bone. She leveled the Colt at the center of the door and fired. The bullet punched through the wood. She cocked the hammer and fired again. And again. The noise was deafening, the cabin filling with thick, acrid gun smoke that burned her eyes and throat. Click! The hammer fell on an empty chamber. She had fired all 6 rounds. Before she could reload, a final massive swing of the axe shattered the locking mechanism. Gideon kicked the splintered remains of the door inward. The heavy oak panels crashed against the overturned table, pushing it backward with a screech of grinding wood. Gideon Vance stepped through the ruined doorway. He was breathing heavily, his pristine waistcoat dusted with wood chips, a minor graze from one of her blind bullets bleeding sluggishly on his left arm. But he was smiling. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He stepped over the debris, his boots crunching on broken glass. In his right hand, he held a sleek, silver-plated Smith & Wesson revolver. "Out of ammunition," Gideon noted, stepping into the dim light of the cabin. "Such a shame. You put up a spirited defense. The cowboy taught you well. Too bad he's halfway to Abilene." Cora threw the empty Colt at his head. Gideon batted it away with his forearm. Before Cora could reach the kitchen to grab a knife, he lunged across the overturned table. His hand clamped around her throat, cutting off her air instantly. The sheer physical strength of him, the horrible, familiar weight of his hands on her body, sent a shockwave of old trauma crashing through her system. He slammed her back against the wooden wall of the cabin. The impact rattled her teeth. "Did you really think you could run from me?" Gideon hissed, pressing the cold barrel of the revolver against her temple. His breath smelled of expensive whiskey and mint. His fingers twisted into her hair, yanking her head back until her scalp burned. "Did you think some dirt-poor Texas cowboy could keep what belongs to me?" Cora clawed at the hand around her throat. Her lungs burned. Black spots danced in her vision. She couldn't speak, but she forced her eyes open. She didn't look at him with fear. She stared into his dead, soulless eyes with absolute, unadulterated hatred. Gideon's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He recognized the change. He was expecting the broken, weeping woman he had cultivated in Atlanta. He was not expecting the feral creature staring back at him. "I'm going to kill the brats in the cellar," Gideon whispered, pressing the gun harder against her skull. "And then I'm going to burn this place to the ground, and you are going to watch." He pulled the hammer of his revolver back. The metallic click was loud in the sudden quiet of the room. From the darkness outside, a sound rose above the wind. It was not the thunder of the storm. It was the furious, rhythmic thundering of hooves, iron shoes tearing up the muddy earth, moving at a suicidal, breakneck speed. Gideon frowned, turning his head toward the ruined doorway. Out of the blackness, a massive shadow erupted into the moonlight. Silas Thorne did not stop his horse at the gate. He did not dismount in the yard. He drove the lathered, foam-flecked Mustang straight up the wooden steps and onto the porch. The porch timbers screamed under the weight of the beast. Silas didn't wait for the horse to halt. Moving with the terrifying, lethal speed of a man possessed, he vaulted from the saddle mid-stride. In midair, he leveled his Winchester repeating rifle with one hand. He fired blindly through the doorway. The heavy .44 caliber slug blew the rest of the door frame to splinters, passing mere inches from Gideon's face. The shockwave and showering splinters caused Gideon to flinch, his grip on Cora's throat loosening for a critical fraction of a second. It was all the opening Silas needed. He crashed through the ruined doorway like a force of nature, dropping the rifle and launching his entire 220-pound frame directly at Gideon Vance. The longest night was not over. It was just beginning. The impact sounded like two freight trains colliding. Silas hit Gideon with enough velocity to shatter bone. The sheer momentum drove both men backward, crashing through the remaining barricade of the overturned table and launching them violently out of the cabin, through the splintered doorway, and off the edge of the porch. They hit the muddy, rain-slicked yard in a tangle of limbs and fury. Cora gasped for air, dropping to her knees on the cabin floor as oxygen rushed painfully back into her starved lungs. She grabbed her throat, coughing violently, the black spots slowly clearing from her vision. Outside, the yard had become an arena of pure savagery. Silas was not fighting like a gentleman, nor was he fighting like a cowboy in a saloon brawl. He was fighting to eradicate a threat. He scrambled to his knees in the deep mud, his massive fist coming down like a hammer, connecting with Gideon's jaw with a sickening crack. Gideon's head snapped back, spraying blood into the rain. But Gideon was younger, unburdened by the grueling physical labor of a ranch, and completely undamaged. Silas, conversely, was fighting on borrowed time. The brutal ride back from the Caprock escarpment had taken its toll. As he raised his arm for a second strike, his broken ribs shifted agonizingly in his chest. A sharp, involuntary hiss of pain escaped Silas's lips, and his strike faltered for a microsecond. Gideon seized the weakness. He bucked his hips upward, throwing Silas off balance, and drove a knee viciously into Silas's compromised ribcage. Silas let out a raw, guttural roar of agony, rolling off Gideon and splashing into the freezing muck. Gideon scrambled to his feet, wiping a mixture of mud and blood from his mouth. His pristine suit was ruined, his aristocratic veneer completely stripped away, revealing the rabid, violent animal beneath. "You should have stayed with your cows, Thorne," Gideon spat, reaching to the small of his back. From a hidden sheath beneath his waistcoat, Gideon drew a knife. The blade was 6 inches of polished, lethal steel, gleaming in the intermittent moonlight breaking through the clouds. Cora staggered to her feet inside the cabin. She looked frantically for her Colt, but she had thrown it. It was lost somewhere in the debris of the ruined room. Outside, Silas pushed himself up onto one knee, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing gasps. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, his broken ribs making every movement an exercise in pure torture. He reached for his hip, but his holster was empty. His revolver had been lost in the fall from the porch. Gideon didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, the knife flashing in a deadly upward arc. Silas threw his right forearm up to block the strike, but Gideon was too fast. The blade sank deep into the meat of Silas's left shoulder, grinding against the collarbone. Silas let out a choked grunt, grabbing Gideon's wrist with his good hand to stop the blade from twisting. The two men locked together in a desperate grapple, slipping and sliding in the treacherous mud. Blood poured from Silas's shoulder, turning the red Texas earth black. "I'm going to gut you like a pig," Gideon snarled, his face inches from Silas's, bearing down with all his weight on the knife hilt. "And then I'm going to make her clean it up." Silas's strength was failing. The blood loss and the agonizing pain in his ribs were draining the iron from his muscles. His knee buckled, and he sank lower into the mud, Gideon pressing the advantage, forcing the blade deeper. Inside the cabin, Cora's eyes locked onto the Winchester rifle Silas had dropped when he breached the door. It lay half buried in the shattered wood of the porch. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Cora launched herself through the splintered doorway, her boots hitting the wooden planks. She dropped to her knees, her fingers wrapping around the cold, wet steel barrel of the Winchester. She hoisted it up, feeling the heavy, familiar weight Silas had forced her to carry on that first morning. She racked the lever. The sharp mechanical clack cut through the sound of the rain and the grunting men. Gideon heard the sound. He snapped his head up, his eyes widening as he saw Cora standing on the edge of the porch, the heavy, repeating rifle braced firmly against the meat of her shoulder. Her feet were planted shoulder-width apart. Her dominant leg was back. Her wrist was locked. She was not the broken, weeping wife he had beaten in Atlanta. She was not the fragile mail-order bride Silas Thorne had tried to send away. She was Cora Vance, and she had drawn a line in the Texas dirt that no monster would ever cross again. "Cora," Gideon said, his voice suddenly losing its bravado, replaced by a flicker of genuine realization. "Don't—" Cora didn't aim with her eye. She pointed with her arm. She pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking back hard against her shoulder, but this time her stance held. The recoil pushed her, but it did not break her. The .44 caliber slug took Gideon Vance dead in the center of his chest. The impact lifted him entirely off Silas. He flew backward, the knife slipping from his grasp, and hit the mud with a heavy, lifeless splash. He lay perfectly still, his sightless eyes staring up at the clearing sky, the rain washing the blood from his ruined gray suit. The silence that descended upon Thorn Creek was absolute, broken only by the steady drum of the rain. Cora lowered the rifle, her chest heaving. She stared at the body of the man who had haunted her every waking moment for the last 2 years. The phantom was gone. It was just meat and mud. She felt no regret. She felt no sorrow. She felt an overwhelming, profound emptiness that was rapidly filling with the clean, cold air of freedom. "Silas!" Cora dropped the rifle and threw herself off the porch, landing in the mud beside the massive cowboy. Silas was slumped on his side, his hand pressing weakly against the severe stab wound near his collarbone. Dark arterial blood was pulsing between his fingers, mixing with the rain. His face was chalk white, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Cora," he rasped, his eyes struggling to focus on her face. "The kids—" "They're safe. They're in the cellar," Cora said, her hands moving frantically. She tore the remnants of her apron off, wadded the thick cotton into a ball, and pressed it brutally hard against his wound. Silas groaned, his head rolling back into the mud. "Keep your eyes open," Cora ordered, her voice cracking with terror. "You don't get to die on me, Silas Thorne. You made me a promise. You said you had me. You hold the line." Pete came riding furiously into the yard, his horse nearly collapsing from exhaustion. He had followed Silas back from the escarpment as fast as his aging bones would allow. Taking one look at the carnage in the yard, Pete threw himself out of the saddle, limping heavily toward them. "Lord Almighty," Pete breathed, looking at Gideon's body and then at Silas. "He's bleeding out, Cora." "Help me get him inside. We have to stitch it," Cora commanded. Together, straining under his immense weight, they hauled Silas out of the mud and dragged him into the ruined cabin. Cora yelled for Caleb, who pushed the trapdoor open, his eyes wide with fear as he saw the blood. "Towels, Caleb! Clean water from the buckets, now!" Cora barked, taking absolute control. For the next hour, the cabin was a flurry of grim, desperate medical triage. Cora poured raw whiskey into the deep knife wound, ignoring Silas's muffled scream of agony as Pete held his shoulders down. Using a curved suturing needle and heavy horsehair thread, she sewed the torn muscle and flesh back together, her hands coated in his blood, her movements precise and unyielding. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bound his shoulder with clean linen, Silas had passed out from the pain. His pulse was weak, but it was steady. Cora sat back on her heels, her entire body shaking. She looked at her blood-stained hands, the reality of the night crashing down on her. Pete limped back into the cabin. He had been outside, dragging the bodies of Gideon and his hired gun away from the porch. He held a leather wallet and a folded, blood-soaked piece of parchment in his weathered hand. "Found this inside the bastard's coat pocket," Pete said, his voice grim. He handed the parchment to Cora. Cora wiped her hands on her ruined skirt and took the paper. She unfolded it carefully. It was a contract. Payment of $1,000 to be rendered to Gideon Vance upon the confirmed death of Silas Thorne and the destruction by fire of the primary residence at Thorn Creek. An additional $500 will be paid upon the successful capture and removal of Cora Vance from the county limits. At the bottom of the page, signed in elegant, unmistakable black ink, was the signature, Thaddeus Blackwood. Cora stared at the signature. The cold, ironclad resolve that had allowed her to shoot a man and sew another back together crystallized into something sharper, something weaponized. "Blackwood didn't just buy the banknote," Cora whispered, looking up at Pete. "He put a bounty on Silas's head. He hired my husband to murder him." "It's proof," Pete said, realizing the magnitude of the document. "It's hard, written proof of conspiracy to commit murder. If the sheriff sees this, Blackwood swings from a rope, banknote, or no banknote." Cora looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner of the ruined room. It was 3 a.m. The foreclosure deadline was noon today. If they didn't present this evidence before Blackwood legally seized the property, he would have the law on his side, and Silas would be trespassing on his own land. Cora looked down at Silas. He was unconscious, pale, and broken. He had ridden his horse to the point of death to come back for her. He had thrown himself into the path of a monster to save her life. She stood up. She walked to the wash basin, plunging her blood-stained hands into the cold water, scrubbing the red from her skin until it was raw. She dried her hands, walked over to the table, and picked up the Colt .45. She broke the cylinder, dumping the empty brass casings onto the floor, and began reloading it with fresh, heavy rounds. "Saddle the wagon, Pete," Cora said quietly, snapping the cylinder shut with a sharp flick of her wrist. Pete stared at her. "Cora, the man is half dead. We can't move him." "We are putting him in the back of the wagon, and we are driving to Oakhaven," Cora replied, her voice leaving no room for argument. She turned to face the old ranch hand, her eyes burning with a terrifying, beautiful ferocity. "Silas fought my monster. Now I am going to finish his." The wagon wheels sank 6 inches into the Texas mud with every grueling rotation. The rain had slowed to a miserable, freezing drizzle, but the damage to the roads was absolute. What was normally a 2-hour ride into Oakhaven had stretched into an agonizing 4-hour nightmare of slipping hooves and grinding axles. Cora sat on the buckboard, the heavy leather reins wrapped so tightly around her raw, blistered hands that her knuckles bled. She wore Silas's oversized canvas duster, the heavy material soaked through, offering little protection against the biting chill. Beside her on the bench lay the Winchester rifle, its barrel still smelling faintly of burnt powder. Behind her, in the bed of the wagon, Silas lay on a bed of damp hay. He was eerily quiet. Cora had checked his bandages twice since they left Thorn Creek. The bleeding had slowed to a sluggish seep, but the fever had set in rapidly. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing a shallow, ragged rasp that tore at Cora's nerves more violently than the sound of gunfire. Pete had stayed behind at the ranch to guard the children and the property. This final ride belonged to Cora and Silas alone. Cora pulled a silver pocket watch from her apron pocket, a watch she had stripped from Gideon's dead body before leaving the yard. 11:20 a.m. The foreclosure deadline was noon. Blackwood would be sitting in his warm, dry office at the Oak Haven Fidelity Bank, waiting for the clock to strike 12 so he could legally instruct the sheriff to seize Thorn Creek. "Shah!" Cora screamed, her voice cracking as she snapped the reins over the exhausted team of draft horses. "Pull, damn you! Pull!" The horses snorted, their massive shoulders straining against the harnesses, dragging the heavy wooden wagon out of a deep rut. At 11:40 a.m., the wooden buildings of Oak Haven materialized through the gray mist. The town was virtually deserted, its citizens taking shelter from the weather in the saloons and boarding houses. The streets were rivers of churning brown muck. Cora drove the wagon straight down the center of Main Street. She didn't head for the doctor's office. She didn't look for the sheriff's station. She drove the exhausted, steaming horses directly onto the boardwalk in front of the two-story brick facade of the Oak Haven Fidelity Bank, halting the wagon with a violent jerk that rattled the windows. She tied off the reins and turned around. Silas was trying to sit up. His left arm was strapped to his chest, the entire left side of his shirt stained a dark, rusty brown. His face was a mask of pure, concentrated agony, but his eyes, those storm cloud gray eyes, were terrifyingly lucid. "Silas, stay down," Cora ordered, scrambling into the back of the wagon. "I have the contract. I can take it to the sheriff." "No." Silas's voice was a gravelly rasp. He gripped the wooden side of the wagon with his right hand, his knuckles white. "He's taking my land. He sent a man to butcher you in my home. I am not sending a woman to finish my fight." "You have a hole in your chest and broken ribs," Cora fired back, her hands hovering over him, desperate to push him back down, but terrified of hurting him worse. "If you walk in there, you might bleed to death on his floor." Silas looked up at her, his jaw set in a line of immovable granite. "Then I'll make sure it ruins his expensive Persian rug." He didn't ask for her help, but he couldn't do it alone. Cora saw the fierce, absolute stubbornness in his eyes and knew better than to argue. She hooked her shoulder under his good right arm, bracing her stance in the muddy wagon bed. Together, moving with agonizing slowness, they managed to get Silas to his feet. He swayed dangerously, his breathing hitching, but he locked his knees. He reached down with his right hand and pulled his Winchester from the buckboard. He couldn't lift it to his shoulder, but he could hold it at his hip. It was enough. "Let's go," Silas grunted. Cora supported his weight as they stepped off the wagon and onto the boardwalk. Her boots left bloody, muddy footprints on the clean wooden planks. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing the heavy, folded parchment of the murder contract. Beneath her skirt, the loaded Colt .45 banged reassuringly against her thigh. The brass handles of the bank's double doors were cold. Cora pushed them open. The interior of the bank was a stark contrast to the brutal reality of the plains. It smelled of lemon oil, cigar smoke, and polished mahogany. A crystal chandelier cast a warm, opulent glow over the brass teller cages. The bank manager, a thin, nervous man named Higgins, looked up from his ledger. His eyes widened in absolute horror at the sight of them. Silas Thorne, a giant of a man soaked in blood and mud, leaning heavily against a woman who looked like she had just walked out of a slaughterhouse carrying a repeating rifle. "Mr. Thorne," Higgins squeaked, scrambling backward off his stool. Good God, man, you're bleeding. Let me fetch the doctor. Where is he? Silas rumbled, the sound vibrating in his chest. Higgins swallowed hard, pointing a trembling finger toward the heavy oak door at the back of the lobby. Mr. Blackwood's office. But you can't go in there. Cora didn't wait for him to finish. She practically dragged Silas across the marble floor, leaving a stark trail of red and brown in their wake. She didn't bother knocking. She raised her muddy boot and kicked the heavy oak door open with enough force to crack the hinges. Thaddeus Blackwood was sitting behind a massive clawfoot mahogany desk. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a gold pocket watch chain draped across his vest, and held a lit cigar between his manicured fingers. He looked up, his expression shifting from mild irritation to profound shock. For a man who orchestrated violence, he was clearly unaccustomed to it walking into his sanctuary. "Thorne," Blackwood said, recovering quickly, his voice smooth and utterly devoid of empathy. He leaned back in his leather chair, taking a slow pull from his cigar. "I must admit, I didn't expect you to make the deadline. Though showing up at 10 minutes to noon bleeding on my floor doesn't exactly scream fiscal responsibility. Do you have my $2,400? "I don't have your money, Blackwood," Silas said, his breathing shallow. He leaned against the door frame, keeping himself upright through sheer willpower, his right hand gripping the Winchester at his hip. Blackwood smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of his lips. "Then you are trespassing. Higgins," he called out over Silas's shoulder, "go fetch Sheriff Hayes. Mr. Thorne is refusing to vacate my property." "It's not your property." Cora stepped forward, moving away from Silas. Blackwood's gaze slid to her. He took in her ruined dress, the mud smeared across her face, and the feral, unblinking intensity in her eyes. "Ah, the mail-order bride. Gideon warned me you were a stubborn creature. A pity. You could have saved yourself a lot of grief if you had just gone quietly back to Atlanta." Cora didn't yell. She didn't scream. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out the blood-soaked parchment, and walked deliberately across the plush Persian rug. She slammed the paper flat onto the center of his immaculate mahogany desk. "I prefer Texas," Cora said, her voice dropping to a lethal, icy whisper. Blackwood frowned, looking down at the parchment. The blood obscured some of the words, but his own elegant, undeniable signature at the bottom was perfectly legible. The terms of the bounty, the $1,000 for Silas's murder, the $500 for Cora's capture, stared back at him. The color drained entirely from Blackwood's face. The smug, untouchable aura of the wealthy land baron vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by the naked, cornered panic of a criminal. "Where did you get this?" Blackwood breathed, his eyes darting to Cora. "From the pocket of the man you sent to kill my husband," Cora replied softly. "He won't be needing the bounty. I shot him through the heart." Blackwood's hand twitched. His eyes darted to the top right drawer of his desk. It was a micro-expression, a slight tensing of the shoulder. But Cora had spent her life anticipating the sudden violence of men. Before Blackwood could open the drawer, Cora swept her hand beneath her heavy skirt. In one fluid, blindingly fast motion, she drew the Colt .45, cocked the heavy hammer, and leveled the barrel directly at the bridge of Thaddeus Blackwood's nose. Blackwood froze, his hand hovering inches from the drawer pull. "Open it," Cora whispered, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Open the drawer, Mr. Blackwood. Give me a reason to finish what you started." The heavy silence in the office was broken by the sound of heavy boots rushing across the marble lobby. Sheriff Hayes, a broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest, burst through the open doorway, his hand on his revolver. "Hold it!" Hayes barked, taking in the chaotic scene. Silas bleeding against the doorframe, Cora holding a gun to the town's wealthiest citizen. "Mrs. Thorne, lower the weapon, right now." Cora didn't lower the gun. She didn't even blink. "Read the paper on his desk, Sheriff." Hayes looked at Silas, who gave a single rigid nod. The sheriff cautiously holstered his weapon and stepped up to the desk, keeping a wary eye on the Colt in Cora's hand. He looked down at the blood-stained contract. He read it once. He read it twice. When Hayes looked up, his jaw was clenched so tight the muscle jumped. He looked at Blackwood, absolute disgust radiating from his eyes. "Conspiracy to commit murder," Hayes said, his voice heavy with the weight of the law. "Bounty hunting on a private citizen. Arson." "It's a forgery," Blackwood sputtered, finally finding his voice, though it lacked its usual authority. "A desperate ploy by a man about to lose his land. You can't possibly believe—" "I know your signature, Thaddeus," Hayes interrupted sharply. "I've seen it on enough foreclosure notices this past year, and I know Gideon Vance was drinking in the Silver Dollar yesterday. Stand up." Blackwood didn't move. He stared at the barrel of Cora's gun. "Mrs. Thorne," Hayes said gently, "I have him. Put the gun away." Cora's hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the massive, overwhelming rush of adrenaline and the terrifying temptation to simply squeeze the trigger and rid the world of one more monster. She looked at Silas. Silas was watching her. He didn't order her to lower the gun. He simply held her gaze, a silent anchor in the storm, letting her make the choice. Slowly, carefully, Cora uncocked the hammer with her thumb and lowered the heavy iron revolver to her side. Sheriff Hayes moved around the desk, grabbing Blackwood roughly by the collar of his expensive suit and hauling him to his feet. He pulled a pair of heavy iron cuffs from his belt and ratcheted them tightly around Blackwood's wrists. "Higgins!" the sheriff yelled toward the lobby. The trembling bank manager appeared in the doorway. "Bring the deed and the mortgage note for Thorn Creek in here," Hayes ordered. "Right now." Higgins scrambled to obey, returning seconds later with a thick file. He placed it on the desk. "Mr. Blackwood," Hayes said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Seeing as how this debt was acquired through a criminal conspiracy aimed at murdering the note holder, the county is seizing this asset as evidence, which means, as of right now, this note is void." Hayes took a pen from the inkwell, shoved it into Higgins's hand. "Stamp it paid in full and sign the release, Higgins, or you'll be sharing a cell with him for aiding and abetting." Higgins whimpered, stamped the heavy red ink onto the parchment, and hurriedly scribbled his signature across the release line. He slid the deed toward Cora. Cora picked up the paper. It felt weightless in her hands, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 acres, of a home, of her life. She turned to Silas. The tension that had been holding him upright seemed to snap. His eyes rolled back, his knees buckled, and the Winchester slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. "Silas!" Cora dropped the gun and the deed, lunging across the room to catch his massive frame before he hit the ground. He was out cold, his blood soaking through her dress. The fight was over. The land was safe. But the man who had traded his life for it was fading fast in her arms. The ride back to Thorn Creek was a silent, agonizing blur. The town doctor, a gruff man named Henderson, had met them at the bank. He had taken one look at Silas's makeshift stitches, grunted his reluctant approval of Cora's brutal handiwork, and properly dressed and bound the wound, pumping Silas full of laudanum to keep him unconscious for the grueling journey home. By the time the wagon rolled through the wooden gates of Thorn Creek, the late afternoon sun had finally broken through the heavy cloud cover. It cast a golden, fragile light across the mud-soaked plains, making the puddles in the yard gleam like scattered coins. Pete limped out of the barn, followed quickly by Caleb and Maeve. The children stopped dead in their tracks at the sight of the blood-stained wagon, but Cora didn't let them panic. "He's alive," Cora called out, her voice raspy but steady. "He just needs to sleep. Pete, help me get him inside." They managed to carry Silas into the cabin, laying him carefully on the large iron bed in the main room. The cabin still smelled of gun smoke and shattered wood. The front door was a splintered ruin, the barricade pushed aside. It was the shell of a battlefield, but to Cora, as she pulled a heavy wool quilt over Silas's chest, it was the most beautiful place on earth. For the next 2 days, time lost its meaning. Cora moved like an automaton, driven by necessity and the lingering dregs of adrenaline. She directed Pete to begin repairing the front door and the broken windows. She boiled water, scrubbed the blood from the floorboards, and cooked heavy, nourishing stews. She sat by Silas's bedside through the night, dripping water past his dry lips, pressing cool cloths to his feverish forehead, and listening to the ragged, uneven rhythm of his breathing. On the evening of the third day, the fever finally broke. Cora was sitting in the rocking chair beside the bed, mending the tear in Silas's canvas duster, when she heard the rustle of the quilt. She looked up. Silas's eyes were open. The cloudy, glazed look of the fever was gone, replaced by the sharp, clear intelligence that defined him. He looked at the ceiling, then slowly turned his head to look at her. "You look like hell," Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Cora let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh. She dropped the duster and leaned forward, her hands hovering over him, wanting to touch him but terrified of causing him pain. "You have no room to talk, cowboy. You lost half your blood on the bank floor." Silas closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the reality of waking up in his own bed. "Blackwood?" "In the county jail," Cora said softly. "The circuit judge is coming next week. Sheriff Hayes said Blackwood won't see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The banknote is void. The deed is clear." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the crisp stamped parchment, laying it on the quilt over his chest. Silas looked at the paper. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just stared at the red ink that spelled out "paid in full," his jaw tightening. He reached out with his right hand, his fingers brushing the parchment, before his gaze shifted back to Cora. He studied her face. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the raw blisters on her hands, the way she held herself, rigid, guarded, waiting for the next blow to fall, even though the war was won. "The children?" Silas asked. "They're outside with Pete," Cora said. "They're safe, Silas. Everyone is safe." Silas gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. "Help me up." "Absolutely not," Cora snapped, her protective instincts flaring. "The doctor said you need to stay flat for at least a week." "Help me up, Cora," Silas repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice of a man who gave orders to the wind and expected it to obey. "I need to go outside." Cora glared at him, but she knew the stubbornness of a Texas rancher. She sighed, sliding her arm carefully behind his uninjured shoulder. With agonizing slowness, he swung his legs over the side of the bed. He gritted his teeth, a hiss of pain escaping his lips as his boots hit the floorboards, but he forced himself to stand. He leaned heavily on her, his arm draped over her shoulders. He smelled of clean linen, carbolic soap, and the faint metallic scent of healing skin. Cora wrapped her arm around his waist, supporting his massive weight, and slowly guided him out of the bedroom and toward the open front doorway. The evening air was cool and crisp. The sky was an endless expanse of deepening twilight blue, dusted with the first pale stars. Pete had managed to hang a temporary door, but he had left it open to let the fresh air into the cabin. Silas stopped on the threshold of the porch, leaning against the doorframe. He looked out over his land. The rusted water pump was silent. The horses were quiet in the corral. In the distance, Caleb and Maeve were tossing a stick for one of the ranch dogs. It was peaceful. It was profoundly, impossibly quiet. The silence should have been comforting, but to Cora it felt heavy. It felt like the terrible, breathless pause right before a stagecoach drops you off in the dirt. The immediate threat was gone. Gideon was dead. Blackwood was in chains. The ranch was saved. Which meant the desperate, violent necessity that had bound them together, the absolute need for a protector and a fighter, was no longer there. Cora looked down at her scarred hands. She was a mail-order bride ordered out of desperation to keep two children alive while their father fought a war. The war was over. She had no dowry. She had no pedigree. She was just a woman with a ruined past and a penchant for violence. Silas shifted his weight. He reached into the front pocket of his canvas trousers with his good hand. Cora watched as he pulled out a folded piece of heavy, cream-colored paper. It wasn't the deed to the ranch. It was a document bearing the official seal of the state of Texas and the stamp of the matrimonial agency in Atlanta. It was their proxy marriage certificate. The legal document that bound them together, signed by a judge hundreds of miles away, tying a desperate woman to an exhausted man. Silas looked at the paper for a long, unreadable moment. The fire pit in the yard, which Pete had lit to burn the ruined debris from the broken door, was smoldering a few yards from the porch steps. Without a word, Silas pushed off the doorframe. He took 3 agonizing, limping steps toward the edge of the porch. Cora's heart stopped beating. The blood drained from her face, her stomach plummeting into a cold, bottomless abyss. No. She watched, paralyzed, as Silas extended his hand over the porch railing. He opened his fingers. The marriage certificate fluttered through the cool evening air. It landed dead center in the glowing red embers of the fire pit. Instantly, the edges curled, turning black, before a sudden tongue of yellow flame caught the dry paper. In less than 3 seconds, the legal document that made Cora Vance the wife of Silas Thorne was reduced to gray ash. Cora stood frozen on the porch, her breath trapped in her throat. He had burned it. He had burned the only thing tethering her to this place. The fight was over, the ranch was secure, and he was clearing the slate. He was a proud, fiercely independent man who had been forced into an arrangement by a dying bank account. And now, he didn't need her anymore. A sharp, unbearable ache bloomed behind her ribs. It hurt worse than the bullet graze, worse than Gideon's hands on her throat. She had finally found a place to plant her boots, a place she had bled for, a man she had dragged out of the mud, and he was cutting her loose. Silas turned back to face her. The firelight flickered across his harsh, beautiful features. His expression was completely unreadable. "The deal is done," Silas said, his voice like grinding stones in the quiet twilight. Cora swallowed the massive, suffocating lump in her throat. She refused to cry. She lifted her chin, locking her jaw, summoning the iron fortress that had kept her alive for 10 years. She would pack her single leather valise. She would walk to town if she had to. She would not beg a man to keep her. "I'll have my bags packed by morning," Cora said, her voice entirely flat, devoid of the devastation ripping her apart inside. "If Pete can drive me to the station—" "What the hell are you talking about?" Silas's brow furrowed, a flash of genuine confusion and sudden dark anger crossing his face. He took a step toward her, ignoring the pain in his chest. Cora pointed a trembling finger at the smoking ashes in the fire pit. "You just burned the marriage certificate, Silas. The arrangement is over. You have your land back. You don't need a mail-order bride anymore." Silas stopped a foot away from her. He stared down at her, seeing the fierce, desperate pride in her eyes and the sheer terror she was trying to hide behind it. Slowly, painfully, Silas reached his good hand back into his pocket. He pulled out a second folded document. This one was thicker, bound with a fresh red wax seal from the county clerk's office. He didn't hand it to her. He slapped it down onto the wooden railing of the porch, the heavy thwack echoing in the quiet yard. "Read it," Silas commanded softly. Cora looked at him, then down at the paper. With shaking fingers, she broke the wax seal and unfolded the document. It was a deed, but it wasn't the deed Blackwood had held. It was a new filing, drafted and stamped by Sheriff Hayes and the county clerk that very afternoon, while she had been asleep in the rocking chair. "Let it be known that ownership of the property legally defined as Thorn Creek Ranch, encompassing 1,000 acres, structures, and livestock, is hereby transferred and equally divided into joint ownership between Silas Thorne and Cora Thorne." Cora's breath hitched. Her eyes darted across the words, unable to process the legal terminology, unable to comprehend the staggering, impossible weight of what she was holding. She looked up at him. her vision suddenly blurring with the tears she had refused to shed for years. "Silas, I don't understand. Why?" "I didn't buy you out of a catalog, Cora," Silas said, his voice dropping to a fierce, raw whisper. He stepped closer, eliminating the space between them, his massive frame shielding her from the wind. "You bled for this land. You took a bullet for it. You saved my life. And you protected my children when I wasn't here to do it." He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping away a tear that had finally spilled over her lashes. "That piece of paper I threw in the fire? That was a transaction," Silas said, his gray eyes burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "It was a deal made by a desperate man looking for a housekeeper. I don't want a housekeeper. And I don't want a woman who thinks she owes me her life because her name is on a proxy contract." He tapped the deed in her trembling hands. "That paper makes you an owner," Silas continued, his voice trembling slightly with the raw, terrifying vulnerability of a man laying his soul bare. "You have land. You have money in the herd. You have a horse in the barn. For the first time in your life, Cora, you hold the keys to your own cage." He stepped back, giving her space, though it clearly cost him everything to do it. "The gate is open," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are truly free to go anywhere you want." Cora stared at the deed, the iron fortress inside her. The walls she had built to survive the cruelty of the world didn't just crack. They shattered into a million pieces, dissolving into the Texas dirt. He was giving her the one thing no man had ever given her, the power to leave, the ultimate absolute agency over her own destiny. Cora looked at the open gate at the end of the drive. Then she looked at the giant, battered cowboy standing in front of her, bleeding and bruised, offering her the world and asking for nothing in return. She took the heavy, officially stamped deed, and she tore it cleanly in half. Silas's eyes widened in shock as she dropped the torn pieces onto the porch floorboards. Before he could speak, Cora stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She grabbed the lapels of his unbuttoned shirt, careful of his wound, and looked up into his stunned gray eyes. "I told you on the first day," Cora whispered fiercely, a tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "I have nowhere else to go. This is my home." Silas let out a ragged, shattered breath. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped his right arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid, unyielding chest, and brought his mouth down on hers. It was not a gentle, polite kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply profound. It tasted of salt, rain, and the metallic tang of survival. It was the collision of two people who had walked through the fires of hell and found the only cool, quiet place left on earth in each other's arms. Cora buried her hands in his hair, kissing him back with every ounce of the fierce, unyielding passion she had kept locked away for a decade. She felt the heavy, steady thud of his heart against her chest, anchoring her, grounding her to the earth. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing heavily, Silas rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed, a look of absolute transcendent peace settling over his harsh features. "Stay," he whispered against her lips, the echo of his very first command to her, now a desperate plea. Cora smiled, the expression feeling strange and wonderful on her face. She rested her hands flat against his chest, feeling the solid, immovable strength of the man who had finally made her stop running. "Try and make me leave, cowboy," she whispered back. "I dare you." Healing, Cora learned, was not a gentle process. It was loud, it was ugly, and it required a stubbornness that bordered on madness. For the first 2 weeks following the bloodbath in the yard, Silas Thorne was a terrible patient. Confined to the heavy iron bed by the sheer physical trauma of a punctured shoulder and fractured ribs, the massive cowboy was forced to watch a 95-pound woman run his ranch. He hated it, and Cora relished it. The morning sun sliced through the newly glazed windows of the cabin, casting long, pale squares of light across the scrubbed floorboards. Cora stood at the cast-iron stove, flipping thick slices of salted pork in a cast-iron skillet. She wore a simple, clean cotton dress she had purchased from Miller's Mercantile, at a deeply discounted price, as Mr. Miller had suddenly become incredibly accommodating to the Thorne family following Blackwood's arrest. Behind her she heard the unmistakable creak of the bed springs, followed by a muffled, creative string of curses. Cora didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the sizzling meat. "If you put your boots on, Silas Thorne, I will take the Winchester off the mantel and shoot you in your good shoulder." "I've been lying on my back for 14 days, Cora," Silas growled. The heavy thud of a leather boot dropping to the floor echoed in the room. "The herd needs to be moved to the lower pasture. Pete's knee is acting up, and Caleb isn't big enough to push the strays." Cora calmly slid the skillet off the heat. She wiped her hands on her apron, turned, and walked into the bedroom. Silas was sitting on the edge of the mattress, his chest bare save for the thick white linen bandages wrapping his left side. His muscles were corded with tension, his jaw set in that familiar, immovable line. He looked dangerous, exhausted, and incredibly handsome. Cora walked right up to him. She didn't cower from his temper. She planted her hands on her hips and looked down at him. "Pete moved the herd yesterday," Cora informed him, her voice perfectly level. "Caleb rode flank, and I took the rear. We lost exactly 0 head of cattle. The water troughs are full, the south fence is mended, and the horses are fed." Silas stopped reaching for his second boot. He looked up at her, his storm cloud eyes narrowing in disbelief. "You rode drag on 200 head of Hereford cattle?" "I did," Cora said, a faint, proud smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Turns out, cattle are a lot more predictable than men. Now get your boot off, lie back down, and let the muscle knit, or you'll be useless to me for another month." Silas stared at her. The sheer, brazen authority radiating from her small frame was staggering. A month ago, she had stepped off a stagecoach looking like a stiff wind would break her in half. Now she was giving orders on his land, protecting his livelihood, and bossing him around in his own bedroom. The anger bled out of him in a sudden, rushing exhale. The hard lines around his mouth softened, and a slow, devastatingly genuine smile spread across his face. It was the first time she had seen him truly smile, a full, unguarded expression that crinkled the corners of his eyes and made Cora's pulse skip a beat. "Yes, ma'am," Silas murmured, his voice dropping an octave into a gravelly purr. He leaned back against the pillows, wincing slightly, but his eyes never left hers. He reached out with his right hand, his rough, calloused fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. He pulled her down so she was sitting on the edge of the mattress beside him. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his thumb tracing the pulse point at her wrist. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of the things they had survived, and the impossible reality that they were finally safe. "Sheriff Hayes is riding out this afternoon," Silas said quietly, his thumb continuing its slow, mesmerizing rhythm. "Did he send word?" "Saw his deputy in town when Pete went for supplies. The circuit judge came through Oakhaven yesterday." Silas's gaze darkened slightly, the shadow of the violence passing over his features before clearing. "Blackwood pled out to avoid the noose. He's going to the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. 20 years hard labor." Cora took a slow, deep breath. The last lingering phantom of Thaddeus Blackwood dissolved into the Texas air. "And Gideon?" "Buried in the potter's field behind the church," Silas said, his voice flat, completely devoid of remorse. "No marker. The earth swallowed him, Cora. He's gone." Cora looked down at Silas's large, scarred hand holding hers. For a decade, she had flinched at the sudden movement of men. She had slept with one eye open, listening for the sound of an off-key whistle. Now the only sound she heard was the wind sweeping across the plains and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the man beside her. She leaned down, pressing her lips gently against the rough knuckles of his hand. "Good." By late autumn, the brutal Texas heat had surrendered to a crisp, biting chill that turned the scrub oak leaves the color of rusted iron. Silas was finally out of bed, his shoulder bearing a thick, jagged scar, but the muscle had healed solid. He swung an axe with the same terrifying power, rode a horse with the same effortless grace, but there was a fundamental shift in the atmosphere of Thorn Creek. The oppressive, grinding desperation was gone. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Cora was sitting on the porch steps, an empty bushel basket beside her, taking a rare moment of rest. The front door opened. Maeve stepped out onto the porch. The little girl had grown an inch since the summer, her wild, dark hair now neatly braided down her back. She didn't have the haunted, feral look in her eyes anymore. Maeve walked quietly down the steps and stopped in front of Cora. Cora waited, knowing better than to push. Slowly, Maeve brought her hands out from behind her back. She wasn't holding the small hunting knife she used to carry like a talisman against the world. Instead, clutched in her small, dirt-smudged fingers, was a handful of crushed, slightly bruised wild blue bonnets she had picked near the creek. She held them out. Cora felt a sudden, sharp ache in the back of her throat. She reached out, her hands trembling slightly, and took the flowers. "Thank you, Maeve," Cora whispered, her voice thick. "They are beautiful." Maeve looked at the flowers, then up at Cora. The little girl took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and climbed awkwardly into Cora's lap. She wrapped her thin arms around Cora's neck and buried her face in the shoulder of Cora's dress. Cora froze for a fraction of a second, the breath knocked completely out of her lungs. Then she closed her eyes, wrapping her arms tightly around the little girl, resting her chin on top of Maeve's head. From the doorway of the barn, Silas stood watching. He held a bridle in his hands, completely still, observing his daughter, who hadn't let anyone hold her since her mother died, clinging to the woman who had fought a war to keep them safe. Silas swallowed hard, adjusting the brim of his Stetson, and turned back into the shadows of the barn before anyone could see the moisture gleaming in his eyes. 1 year later. The rains came heavy and generous in the spring, turning the vast rolling plains of Thorn Creek into an ocean of vibrant, startling green. The scars on the land had healed. The burnt outer hayward had been cleared and replanted. The shattered front door of the cabin had been replaced with solid, polished oak. The heavy iron barricades removed to let the sunlight flood into the rooms. Cora knelt in the dark, rich soil of the south yard. She wore a sturdy denim skirt and a faded blue cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. The matrix of scars on her forearms was fully visible in the bright morning sun, but she no longer hid them. They were not brands of ownership anymore. They were a map of her survival. She dug her bare hands into the earth, carefully packing the soil around the roots of a small, resilient climbing rose bush she had brought from Oakhaven. A sharp, familiar whistle pierced the air. Not a hymn, but a sharp, two-note call meant for the cattle dogs. Cora looked up, shielding her eyes against the glare of the sun. Silas was riding toward the house on his massive black gelding. He sat deep in the saddle, the picture of absolute, terrifying capability. Beside him rode Caleb, sitting tall on a dappled gray pony, matching his father's posture perfectly. They were driving a dozen strays back toward the main herd. Caleb waved frantically at her. Cora raised a muddy hand and waved back, a brilliant, unguarded smile breaking across her face. Silas broke off from the boy, nudging his horse into an easy lope toward the yard. He reined the animal in near the fence, swung down from the saddle with effortless grace, and tied the reins to the post. He walked across the grass, the silver spurs on his boots chiming softly with every step. Cora stood up, wiping the dirt from her knees. Silas didn't stop until he was standing inches from her. The harsh, unforgiving lines of his face had softened over the past year, though he was still a man built of granite and iron. He reached out, his calloused hands gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He didn't care about the mud on her shirt or the dirt on her hands. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of sun-warmed skin, earth, and lye soap. "You missed breakfast," Cora murmured, resting her hands lightly against his chest, feeling the powerful, steady beat of his heart. "I had to track a calf out of the ravine," Silas rumbled, his lips brushing against her collarbone. He pulled back slightly, looking down into her eyes. The profound, immovable devotion in his gaze was enough to steal the breath from her lungs every single time. He looked at the freshly turned earth, then back at her. "Planting roses?" he asked, his voice low. "I figured it was time we put some color in this yard," Cora said softly. "Something that lasts." Silas's hands tightened on her waist. He looked at the vast expanse of Thorn Creek, the land he had nearly died for, the land they had saved together. Then he looked at the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with nothing but a leather valise and a spine made of steel. "Thank you," Silas whispered, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely bothered to hide from her anymore. "For not running. For staying." Cora smiled. It was a fierce, beautiful expression, untinged by the shadows of her past. She reached up, her dirt-stained fingers resting against his jawline. "I didn't have to run, Silas," Cora said, her voice steady and absolute, echoing across the quiet Texas plains. "I finally found something worth fighting for." She pulled him down by the collar of his shirt, meeting him in a slow, deep kiss that tasted of the sun, the earth, and an unbreakable, hard-won peace. The wind swept through the canyon, rustling the leaves of the new rose bush. It was a harsh land, a violent land, but it was theirs, and their roots were finally deep enough to hold. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.